On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Dan Gremmell. He is the head of data at Policygenius. We're going to cover a unique onboarding situation. Obviously, this is being recorded while we're still in the pandemic. And Dan was onboarded during this time in New York. So definitely some interesting challenges. We're going to talk about what it's like building a data unit capability, delivering within these challenging times. And I appreciate you being on, Dan. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem, Amir. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, man. I gave like a 10-second blurb of who you are. It does not do you justice. Maybe give us a little bit of context of who you are, how you got here, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that setup. So let's work backwards a little bit. I am the head of data at Policygenius. And so I started at Policygenius in March. And the reason why I went to Policygenius is before I was at Policygenius, I was VP of data science at Plated. Plated is and was a meal kit company that was basically focused on curating meals on a weekly basis and assembling them ingredient-wise and then shipping them to people, very much like a HelloFresh or a Sunbasket or something of that nature. I headed up data science there. And at the end of 2019, our parent company made a decision to close or shutter the subscription business, which was based in New York. So everybody at Plated hence went out into the world and found new jobs. And I kind of count my lucky stars. This was before COVID. So I was out in the job market when it was strong. It was before COVID hit. I was able to interview at a ton of places and ultimately ended up Policygenius as the option that I wanted to be at. And Policygenius excited me for a multitude of reasons. Number one, we're in a high growth trajectory. So we're at that stage of the startup where we're growing. There's tons of opportunity, tons of market share that's available to us. Policygenius, at the same time when I was interviewing there, was also one of the more organized companies I've interviewed with, even for a startup. I could tell there was a lot of structure, process, and I was not let down onboarding wise. So we'll save that as we go into onboarding. Yeah, and so the opportunity was fantastic for me. It was the ability to build something new for a growing startup, and hence I decided to move forward to Policygenius. So VP Data Science at Plated, we solved a variety of different problems there, which was interesting because we had both a physical aspect and a digital aspect to our business, online experience versus like delivering food to people. So that was a lot of fun. And we solved a lot of really cool problems there with data. And then before I was at Policygenius, I worked in a couple of different industries in data leadership roles. I worked in publishing for a little while with John Wiley and Sons. I worked for aerospace, automotive companies. I worked for Volkswagen and Audi at some point. I built aerospace components. And then through every job I've had, it's been a data leadership role, either building teams, leading teams, or strengthening that data capability. Education-wise, my background is originally I went for my bachelor's in operations management. So I started off on the business side years and years ago. My first master's was in industrial engineering, and then my second master's was in statistics with a focus in machine learning. And so I did my stats degree at Rochester Institute of Technology. And basically, I would say what I really love to do is kind of what I'm doing, which is going into companies that realize that there's this thing called data, and it's really exciting and interesting. And what gets me excited is to kind of build and strengthen and deepen that capability and learn to leverage data in a fashion that's value added to the company, not just from like reporting and looking at numbers, but being able to extend that into product-facing applications, personalization experiences, optimization algorithms on our backend systems. And that's really what I love to do. So that's the setup. That's the background.
Awesome, man. It's a pretty impressive background. I think we connected while you were at Plated. We tried V1. I think timing didn't work. And then I got you on Policygenius. And I think different subject matter, but still, I think, can be equally as compelling. You brought up something interesting that I wanted to touch on before we kind of dive into the topics we were going to cover. You mentioned when you're interviewing at Policygenius, you noticed how they were organized. What does that mean? What stood out? Because the question I'm going to ask you after that is, when you've been at other organizations or other interviews that is the opposite, what did you see? Just to kind of compare and contrast.
That's a great question. And I'm super happy I left that nugget for you, because anytime I talk to candidates that we're recruiting, I bring this up because it's something that's stuck with me in the interview process that I haven't experienced in a lot of places. And I'll kind of lay out what I mean by that. So throughout the interview process with Policygenius, I found it to be incredibly structured. So a little more context, like there was a team that was trying to hire me and weren't really sure what they should be looking for to an extent, because I'm the first head of data we had. There's nothing to compare to. And so They had an intuition of things they should be testing for, et cetera. But even still, they did a great job with being able to structure the interview process, connect me with the right people that test me on a variety of different capabilities. But all the companies do that. That's not that impressive. What's more impressive is Policygenius really took the time to sell me on who they are as a company. And I got equal amounts of me talking about myself and then learning more about the company in return. And through those interactions of learning more about the company, I learned about the strategy process. I learned about how, teams like engineering operate on a day-to-day basis with sprints, how work gets done, who does what kind of thing, and how we use data today. And kind of what you find in those interactions and nuggets is, oh, there's like actual thought and logic put into these things. And it's not just a free for all. It's not just chaotic. This company thinks about their competitors. They think about what everybody should be working on. They think about what are going to be the best bets to move us forward as a company. And so the reason why that was impressive in the interview process is you might hear those responses from other people that you talk with, et cetera. But why it's even more impressive during the interview process is when I walked in day one, I wasn't let down. So I felt like the company represented itself properly during the interview process. And I was not like surprised and walked into a big mishmash of chaos on the back end side. So I often describe Policygenius as like one of the most structured and efficient startups from a process perspective that I've had the privilege of working with. Startups usually are known for being very chaotic and not having tons of process. So it's refreshing to have a company that's been on that track for a while and is really has their stuff together. That's really nice. And that's really driven by our leadership with our CEO and our co-founders on down. Digging into like day one and walking in, I've walked into other jobs that I felt like would have been a great opportunity for me during the interview process. And I walk in and the environment and the vibe and the culture is completely different. I'm happy to report that that has not been the case with Policygenius, which is rare.
Interesting. So on the back of that, and we work with a lot of startups, and I hear the opposite, where the interview process was interesting. There's some loose issues, and it's just a basket of what ends up happening day one, right? Some people are, have better processes. Some are gets worse, and it's like, well, what you saw during the interview process is kind of reflective. Now, I guess some of the other places you might have been where, and I'm curious whether you're used to having that kind of process and it was just like, oh God, this is great. I'm really feeling like home, or you realize you're missing process. And to you, this was like eye opening that a startup could be as, dialed in as they were.
I think the nature of my perspective is with any company and with any startup, it sounds kind of weird, but the more process and structure you have, the more efficient you're going to be. And to know that we had this structure existed before I got here led me to a lot of confidence in what the company is actually capable of. So on the reverse side of that, other places I've been, I won't mention them by name, but I've been through the interview process and I got a good perception of the interview process, or I was a fan of the product. And then basically what you end up with is you walk in day one and kind of like the idea of the product kind of overwhelmed your senses and you didn't pick up on the signals or the red flags that should be there when you're assessing companies or an interview process. And when you're interviewing, you should absolutely assess the company that you're trying to get into because you have to stick with that decision and you can quit. But I don't have luxury of just quitting jobs and not having another job. Yeah. So I would say that other interview processes I've been in, there's a mix of kind of what you get when you walk in. Either you're just impressed by the product vision and you get in and realize there's kind of no way to get there. So there's no strategy, there's no process, it's a free for all. Or you get a perception the company's structured and well run and you get in and find the complete opposite. People are demotivated, people are quitting, nobody's happy, there's no process, no structure, it's chaotic. Not to downplay some of the companies that work for some great companies, but I've learned to thrive in those situations where there is a little more chaos. And Policygenius is a different challenge because I feel like there's a lot less chaos, which is good. And it allows me to kind of focus and make myself better versus trying to fix a company or make a company better.
That makes sense, and it's interesting. You touched on the component of going into other environments and having the brand maybe overpower. We do a lot of interviewing, and I've learned about this thing called the halo effect. It's a 100+ year old thought, and it is amazing how sometimes those drivers mask some of what we would want to see, but we're so positive on those few factors that we are overwhelmed with our senses that we just kind of miss some of those. So I think that's just common human nature. But that's interesting that day one reflective of the actual, what you saw in the interview process, which isn't always the case. In terms of onboarding, just to touch on that, obviously you mentioned they really were organized and they did a really good job. What was that experience like? And I know, you had a brief period of time. I think you'd mentioned, I might be wrong, correct me, that you were on site before you had to go remote, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I started at the beginning of March when COVID was one of those things that was on the rise. You could see it coming and you kind of mentally portrayed that with, oh, like it's not going to disrupt things here because stuff like this doesn't happen here. So I was able to start in the office when COVID was kind of on the rise. And I was in the office for a few weeks before we went fully remote in the middle of March there. And I consider myself lucky being able to do that because even in my short time there, I was able to build some personal relationships with folks, as well as kind of learn to navigate between people in the office. And I find that gets incrementally harder when you're trying to do that virtually. So in the office, I can see everybody that's there. Virtually, you cannot. And what I mean by that is like you could walk out into the open floor plan and look around and say, hey, I see that person. What do they do? You can't do that remote. So you have no size and semblance or relation of how many people are there and kind of all these people are doing.
Yeah. So I guess the challenge there is, when you first started, how many people are in the team? Like, I was just curious in terms of like, you got to meet team. How big was the team? Yeah, maybe start from that point.
Yeah, great. So yeah, when I walked in, I inherited two direct reports. They're two data engineers, both fantastic. So one of our data engineers, she basically built what is now our data landscape almost by herself. She built the data warehouse, she built and implemented our BI solution, and she knows pretty much where the bodies are buried. Um, and then last year, before I joined, our second data engineer was hired to help extend her capacity. And so those are the two folks I inherited. And they're great folks, but they're data engineers. So their role and responsibility was to basically structure, get our data automated, and pipe it to where it needs to go. But yeah, those are the people we started off with.
And then in terms of the strategy, so you had two direct reports. Was the thought that you were going to grow the team? Is coming in, you knew that already?
Yeah. So because we were in the physical office, my boss walked me to my desk day one, and my desk is right next to our other two data engineers. And there's a whole bunch of empty seats in our area. And he was basically like, the rest of these seats are for your team. So go get busy and go hire them. Yeah, that was the idea. Part of me coming on was to help define and structure our data capability and then to build a hiring plan that consisted of the right roles to bring on at the right amounts to help us achieve our company strategy.
How is, I guess, in terms of going through the process of hiring and bringing people on board, or just even the interview process now that we can't have somebody in the office? How has that changed? I guess your process, how you interview, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it has changed my interview process minimally. So, what I mean by that is we still do the same kinds of screens and the same kinds of sessions we would do in the office, and we get the same people involved. We're doing it on camera now. And the one sacrifice we've had to make is whiteboarding. So normally when I interview somebody for a position on my team, I screen them first with a phone call. That's where I learn about their background, et cetera. And I do that regardless of COVID or non-COVID. We give them a take home to show they can code or to show they have the capabilities and they can express that in a case format. And then when someone comes in the office, the last thing I want to do is talk about their background again because I already know about that. So typically my interviews that I personally do are more case driven where we lay out some scenarios and we talk about their kind of problem solving methodology and the process they go through. And so normally that's like a whiteboarding exercise where I'm like, hey, here's the problem. How would you go about exploring data? What kind of model would you build? What would this process kind of look like? Can you sketch this out for me? And so we've had to kind of sacrifice the whiteboarding aspect of that simply because there are remote options out there, but there's not good general remote options out there. And it's not intuitive for candidates to kind of use a mouse to kind of draw on a whiteboard. It's really weird. So I kind of found a balance in between where I have a virtual whiteboard that I'll open on my side and the candidate can see it. And as we're talking through, I'll try to record some of what they're saying and try to sketch it out for them. And then we kind of collaborate on that. At first, I wasn't doing that, and we tend to get lost in conversation. So I found like showing that whiteboard and kind of myself sketching out and translating their thoughts into ideas is more efficient than just talking.
I've actually been thinking about that whiteboard component. And I was actually talking to one manager and I kind of made a silly statement. I said, it almost would be easier if everyone just, if you're interviewing, let's say 10 finals, just send, 10 $50 whiteboards, mail Amazon it to them, let them have it, say, put it on your wall. We're going to be using that. And, it's a souvenir as well. Just because that's the component that I've been hearing is the gap. That's very hard. You're not in person. You can't see the pauses in the thought process, the direction they're going. And I think without that, obviously you're trying to accommodate by you sketching it out and kind of coming up with other workarounds. But that's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I wouldn't say my solution is the best.
It's a solution.
It's a solution. And to me, it just is the most efficient solution that I found. At first, I tried doing this with no whiteboard, and we tried getting candidates onboarded, and it was just a lot of logistics to coordinate. And so I find if I just kind of control it and just try to translate what they do, it's going to be faster, and we're going to be able to keep track of ideas, and we're going to be able to have a better conversation from that regard. But yeah, like it's actually surprising at like the lack of solutions that there actually are there.
The funny thing is, I think there probably are elaborate solutions that are, designed for conference. I think we could probably pull it out. Having it trickle down to a home office interview. I'm sure there's somebody who's out there working on, doing some type of, projected whatever. I don't know. But I guess from there, I wanted to ask you one thing as a follow up. And again, I don't want to ask a particular question about particular people, but the assessment that you're doing, having lost that in person, what has it changed what you're seeing or how you're able to assess? Have you seen more false positives, false negatives because you're potentially reading into things differently than you were before?
I would say probably not. I feel like we're still getting the same level of false positives that we gotten before COVID. I will say though, one thing that's kind of risen to the top as far as assessment goes is somebody's communication skills, I think, become amplified when you have to do a Zoom call and a virtual interview versus like being in person. I'm not sure if that's an artifact of it's a little awkward on a Zoom call or, you know, you feel like when you're in person, maybe it's easier to walk over and help coach somebody or something of that nature. But we've definitely seen more candidates get rejected from the process because their communication skills just aren't up to par for what we're looking for.
And that's actually an interesting follow up is, I mean, if this is the new normal for the next however months, year, I don't know, like whatever this timeline is, are we going to recalibrate what we expect from that communication skill? Because, like you said before, you could sit down and within a desk conference room work out solutions. You could help guide somebody, but now you're doing it all within, 30-minute hour Zoom call. It's a way different form of communication than if we were doing this podcast in person. I could read body language a lot differently, just the way your leg movement was. So do you think a shift in terms of how we need to perceive communication is going to also have to happen here?
I think body language, believe it or not, probably becomes a little bit less important during an interview where when you have an on-site, I can recall back to the times where maybe you're a little bit influenced by somebody's body language, and that's just harder to pick up in a remote interview. So I kind of appreciate that aspect of it. It kind of takes out some of that, what I feel is maybe some of that bias in the process and how you're assessing somebody. It's like, oh, they were jittery. So it's like, that means they're not a confident person. It's like, well, if somebody's jittery, you maybe can't tell. I tend to move around a lot when I talk and stuff like that. And you might not pick that up as much when you're on the camera, especially on the data science side. Things like efficient communication, collaboration, and being very succinct and efficient in how you communicate ideas, I think is going to become incrementally more important as you assess candidates. Of course, depending on what you're looking for. Most of our data folks, they need to be able to work with stakeholders. They need to be able to communicate on Zoom and extrapolate their ideas, even if they're complicated, to people that may not know what they're talking about or need a little more context. And so being able to efficiently do that on camera is actually going to be a more and more important skill as time goes on here for especially people on my data team. That's kind of what we need. We need people that can go out and have those conversations with stakeholders and efficiently communicate ideas and be able to sketch those things out and be comfortable that they're not in the same room. I would say the other thing it kind of enables is one thing that Policygenius kind of did before COVID or was in the process of was building a second office in Durham, North Carolina. So our main office is in New York City, and And we just opened an office in Durham, North Carolina recently. And the idea was to be able to expand our hiring pool. Well, there's always been kind of a concept of office to office communication and should you centralize product teams within one office? So meaning you should have overlapping teams across offices, et cetera. And COVID has just blown all that up, which has kind of been good because you don't need to worry about centralizing a single team in the same office anymore because we're all going to be used to working remote, that you can have people in Durham, you can have people in New York City, and they can collaborate as a team and build something, and it's going to work.
I mean, that's good forethought in terms of, whether it's going to be centralized versus embedded. And then something like this comes out and you're like, well, maybe that lease doesn't need to be renewed down in North Carolina. Just kidding. But I guess, to kind of segue into, I know we've been talking about, some of the challenges around interviewing. So from your personal side, I guess, as a pivot, you're tasked to building the team, right? So you're working with, different departments, you're working with the business, try to figure out what capabilities are needed. What challenges has that posed for you? Obviously, as we mentioned, you had a couple of weeks in the office, but what challenges has that posed for you to be able to really dial in, to bring the right solution capabilities for Policygenius?
So I would say that it's been incrementally more difficult to kind of grasp what's going on from a business perspective, right? So I think a big part of my role and what I do and what I'm used to doing is being able to understand what meetings are going on, who normally talks, what kind of teams exist, where did they form, how do they make decisions, and it's more difficult to do that when you can't see what conversations are happening because you don't even see people out there around you. So I would say that has been an adjustment I needed to make. I was a little nervous at first because it was a few weeks in, kind of going fully remote. And I was worried I was going to lose step. And what I mean by that is, let's say I'm walking by a meeting room and I see a group of people that I know talking. It's like, oh, I wonder what they're talking about and what's going on there. Something I can help with. So those kinds of things have stopped happening. So I've had to learn to, and I think unfortunately everybody has had to learn to do this with Zoom and with working remote. You can't just walk up to somebody's desk anymore and ask if they need some assistance or understand what problems they have. You have to like book time with them. So I've adjusted to having to find time in people's calendars and book time with them. And everybody else has done that too. So you incrementally have more meetings spread out. So the kind of like ad hoc conversations you'd have on a regular basis just don't happen anymore. So you have to learn to supplement that with something. And unfortunately, I've had to supplement that with meetings and Slack conversations and stuff of that nature. But yeah, that's been one of the biggest challenges, just like what are the things that go on and how the company operates that you can't see, and understanding who normally talks on a regular basis to try to suss out use cases and who you should be talking to is rather difficult.
Do you, on the flip side, see people reaching out to you with problems to solve? Since obviously, you don't have the luxury or the ability to drop in. Are you seeing people go, well, I have this problem, I've got to seek out the person? Is that happening on the flip side?
I think that eventually happened over time, which is common. So when you form a new team, a lot of people don't realize what your team can do and what your team means to them. So I think a big part of how we got good at doing that was number one, kind of setting our org, our scope, as well as our hiring plan and where we're going to embed resources. And then number two was kind of going to the affected teams and people and stakeholders and kind of letting them know, hey, these people are coming. This is the kind of things you can come to us for. These are kinds of problems we can solve. And then that like communication with the rest of the org and the business groups has just naturally gotten better and better over time because people are like, oh, wow, like I need some help setting up an A/B test. Well, Dan's group is the people I need to talk to about this. So let's go to them and let's do that. Or, hey, I'm curious about why this is happening. Oh, wait, we have a data team here now that can help us kind of analyze that. People have started making those mental connections as we've done more and more. But it kind of starts with like grabbing that first use case. And so that's kind of the way I started when we were remote was, let me just grab the first thing I can do that's going to be fast and affect the team, and then naturally branch out from there as we kind of build some wins. So it sounds like a really convoluted answer, but if I had to break it down into a couple of points, I would say the best way we've gotten there was figuring out what those immediate use cases were and who had them. And that's through some high level conversations and then coming down, solving that use case and then kind of communicating that out. And then last but not least, setting up your org and scope and then getting leadership buy-in and communicating that out as well. And that's led to much more organic reach out and much more, hey, I have a problem. I think you folks can help me solve it.
Interesting. How does that tie into maybe your when you first started, and obviously you have some objectives, initiatives you're trying to roll out, provide value, 30, 60, 90 days. How does that tie in with, obviously, if you're in the office, you would probably see different things, and now you have to take a different course to establish some of those priorities?
Yeah. I think from my perspective, the strategy of how I got to 30, 60, 90 maybe didn't change too much. I feel like a lot of the same things I normally would have done popped up. But I think what took a little more time was to kind of gain some of that alignment from having to book meetings and stuff like that. So I think it was more the alignment piece of the 30, 60, 90 and what direction I should move and kind of like bouncing around a little bit. It might have felt a little less efficient from that perspective, and that maybe I didn't move as fast as I would have liked to or normally would have. And then obviously, like picking up some of that business context was really decelerated from being remote. And so figuring out the conversations I needed to get into, as well as just trying to learn and poke around the data, were things I did to try to supplement that. And I would say the biggest thing that helped me was just diving into our data structures and trying to connect it to what I heard. And that's something that you can do remote, thank God.
Yeah, I always talk to engineers, and I'm like, thank goodness there's some components of the job that everyone wanted to do remote, and there's some of the challenges that you've been talking about, especially from a management perspective. But a lot of the day to day, the lifting you could actually do in your own home, which just made this all work for the engineering side.
Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, like the analysis and the building of things is probably the easy part. It may be a little controversial to say that, but like those are the things you could sit down on your computer and do by yourself. It's trying to get those use cases generated, trying to get the buy-in, the change management. Those are the things that become incrementally more difficult when everybody is disconnected and when you don't know kind of what's going on. And so I think we've circumvented some of that by myself, working in depth in the data, connecting it to things I've heard and processes I've seen around the business, as well as getting connected to the leadership team and understanding strategic objectives on down and figuring out where we can plug in and where we can augment our strategic plan for the year. I think those things have all come together in a nice way and we're still building the team out, where when we have resources come on, we know what they're going to do, where they're going to walk into, and where they can add value quickly. And it's helped us gain some of that credibility across the company and help people kind of imagine what they can come to us for.
Awesome, man. It sounds like you found a great spot. I think it sounds like it lines up really well with your background, your experiences. I mean, I'm happy. It sounds like you've got you're building out a good team as well. And hopefully, you continue navigating with these processes, get it more efficient within the constructs of being, remote for as long as we're going to be. And I think, aside from not having a whiteboard, everything else is kind of falling into place.
Yeah, no, things are going well. I mean, it's been challenging just because of the remote thing. And, like I'm pretty comfortable with doing presentations. I've done a lot of like conferences and stuff like that. And I remember my first Zoom presentation, I was nervous. And afterwards, I kind of did a retro mentally. I was like, why was I so nervous? And it's like, well, normally when I do like presentations or something like that, I tend to like get a lot of like collaboration or get a lot of read from the crowd. And when you can't see people, it becomes more daunting. You don't see anybody laughing at your weird jokes, stuff like that. So yeah.
Too awesome. I appreciate you being on, talking to us about your experience, kind of onboarding what we've been talking about, interview challenges. I think it's been really interesting. If somebody wants to reach out to you and they have a question, what's a good medium? LinkedIn, Twitter? If you have a preference of how people would reach out?
Yeah, definitely LinkedIn. I'm heavy on LinkedIn, heavily active.
Heavily active. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So we'll tag that in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on. Hey, everyone, thanks for listening. Appreciate your time. If there's a topic, if there's something you want to hear us dive into with the next guest, let us know. We're always looking for ideas. And leave a review somewhere so we can know the feedback. If it's good, if it's bad, I'd like to just know how to get this podcast bubbling up and reaching more people. So thanks for listening.